Beyond the Blue Mountains, growth of towns. Settlement beyond the Blue Mountains was not just concerned with agricultural or pastoral settlement. Establishing towns was part of official government policy. The very first town settled was Bathurst, which was settled in 1815. In 1823, Wellington was set up as a convict settlement. In the 1830s, a whole network of towns was starting to be established across the district. Hartley was gazetted in 1838, as was Mudgee. Orange had already been gazetted in 1835, and Carcoar was gazetted in 1839. Wellington, despite being the second settlement there, was not gazetted until 1846. Yet these were not the only towns. Throughout the 19th century, the government set up more towns officially. Cowra was established in 1846, Young was surveyed in 1861, and Oberon was proclaimed in 1863. Towns and villages were often set up on reserves which had already been set aside by government surveyors, and these were usually on sites which were thought to be ideal for towns or villages. Of course, many of them weren't, but other factors also influenced which of these became successful. Sometimes there'd be an inn, or there might be a crossing place across a creek or a river, which tended to sort of draw settlement. And often these towns were gazetted, laid out, surveyed around these, and then auctioned off by the government. Apart from the formal process of government towns, other towns sprang up across the district. Private towns were established when people subdivided land that had already been granted to them, such as the town of Montefiores on the other side of the Bell River from Wellington, which actually predated the town of Wellington, and Millthorpe, for example, established on the railway line. Mining also inspired the creation of other towns and villages. Before gold, copper was mined actively across the area. The first mine was Copper Hill, near what is today Molong, which was in operation in 1846, and in 1849 mining started near Bing. Because copper mining was not as active and didn't draw as many people, very few villages were created as a result of copper mining activity. But the village of Bing was one which emerged, and some years later the town of Sunny Corner, which was inspired both by copper and by gold, also emerged. It was gold, however, which gave the biggest shake-up to towns across the district. Every strike attracted a number of people, sometimes in their hundreds, sometimes in their thousands, and a camp would grow up around it. Some of these camps became small villages, not official ones, just a scatter of huts and tents. In time, the government decided that a formal village needed to be laid out. Unlike the other towns, which were established by the government, which had a grid pattern of layout with wide streets and regular lots, a number of the gold towns and gold villages grew up in a more organic fashion. The surveyors that laid the town out often had to lay it out across mines, dams, hotels and other things. They had to weave their streets around all of these. The town of Gulgong is an excellent example of this. Its winding main street is the result of trying to move around existing development and improvements in the area. As a result of gold, you have a number of villages, some of which were established and then sort of withered and died, became very small hamlets, but other ones have survived and are still viable towns today. Hill End, surveyed in 1860, is probably the best known historic gold village. Gulgong is still an active, thriving town, as is Stewart Town, which was proclaimed in 1886. Other types of mining also inspired Kandos in the 20th century and other little places which scarcely exist today, like Airlie. The railway also created a whole network of towns and villages as people settled in spots along the railway. Sometimes these were private villages, at other times they were government villages. Towns that emerged from this process included Millthorpe, Kerrs Creek, Mumble and Dripstone. The towns of the district grew up providing commercial and administrative services. Government services were quite important. Courts, often just courts of petty sessions, catered for the local area, and of course the solicitors were drawn to those sorts of places because that's where their work would be. Doctors would settle in these towns and they would service the surrounding district. But more than that, each town was a commercial centre. There would be stores, usually the basic general store, sometimes larger retailers. Larger retailers grew in some of the bigger towns, such as Dalton Brothers at Orange and later Lonergan's at Mudgee. The little villages might only have a general store, a post office, maybe that the full range of urban services became available. By the late 19th century, quite a number of these places were sophisticated commercial centres. In Orange in 1886, for example, you had accountants, architects, booksellers, coach builders, lawyers, painters and jewellers. This certainly set it up in a different category to nearby towns such as Mumble or Stewart Town, which basically only had basic commercial services, a couple of general stores and a blacksmith. Manufacturing industry also was attracted to the towns. Probably one of the major activities was flour milling. Flour mills emerged in the 1820s, originally on pastoral properties, such as George Rankin's Kellershiel Flour Mill and Brewery, established in 1828. But most of these quickly moved to towns or were set up in towns so that virtually every town of size had a flour mill servicing its district. Bathurst had a flour mill in 1846, Molong had one in 1861, Mudgee in 1865, and Wellington was a bit later in 1877. And the mills were established right across the district in places like Young, Murrumborough and so on. Most of the industrial activity involved processing of local agricultural and pastoral products. Obviously, as the flour mills, there were also abattoirs, mainly catering for a local market. But as well as that, industries emerged that were servicing the towns. Sawmills and brickyards are probably two of the prime examples. Another type of industry which emerged, usually from the 1870s onwards, as larger factories, were the breweries. So Orange saw the Red Lion Brewery established in 1879, and in 1883 Bathurst had the Crown Brewery and Mudgee had the Federal Brewery. These replaced a lot of much smaller breweries which were often 1 and 2 man operations in just a small shop. A similar industry was cordial making, which again catered to the local population. Not everybody was a beer drinker, and with the growth of the temperance movement, obviously people needed something to drink besides water when they didn't want a cup of tea. The physical fabric of many of these towns emerged, graduating from original slab and bark huts, working their way through more formally built cottages made of weatherboards and often roofed with corrugated iron, the establishment of brickyards, the construction of brick dwellings, and in the case of some wealthier owners or government buildings, occasionally stone buildings would be constructed. Across all of these towns and villages, social differentiation was quite obvious in the built fabric of the town. The larger urban villas and larger cottages were owned or occupied by some of the wealthier people in the community. Excellent examples can be seen in Orange and in Bathurst. On the other hand, tenants would occupy row houses. Sometimes these were terraces, sometimes these were attached houses, similar to what we would call a semi-detached today. And some of these can still be seen in places like Mudgee and Wellington. One of the major functions of the towns was the provision of social and cultural facilities. Hotels were everywhere, even outside the towns, and initially they were the centre for most entertainment. Apart from drinking, the hotels would provide facilities for games. Sometimes the publicans organised horse races and other entertainments. In opposition to the hotels, schools of arts or mechanics institutes were established to provide a more intellectual form of recreation. In almost all towns, the original libraries were set up in schools of arts. and continued to be part of those organisations well into the 20th century. Churches were obviously set up as well, providing for religious belief, and to while away the time, sporting clubs. Initially, these were mostly racing clubs, fostering horse racing, but later in the century, tennis clubs emerged and even golf clubs. An important factor in local communication were local newspapers. As early as 1848, Bathurst had the Bathurst Free Press, published in Bathurst and including news from as far away as what today we would call Dubbo and Forbes. In 1861, Mudgee had two newspapers and the Western Examiner was established at Orange. These newspapers reported local news and kept people informed of not just what happened in the town but right across their district. The news in these papers would often go right out to the west as far as Dubbo and beyond. Another factor demonstrating the sophistication of some of these towns was the publication of directories showing the businesses and other facilities of the towns. As always, Bathurst was the first. In 1862, the Bathurst Directory was published. There was not another one till 1882 when Dubbo published its directory. And in 1886, the Bathurst and Western District Directory was published, which included listings for Dubbo, Bathurst, Orange, Wellington, Molong and so on. It saw itself as showing businesses right across the district, and it demonstrates how sophisticated the area had become by that time. The final demonstration of the maturity of these towns was the inauguration of local government. Municipalities could be established from the 1850s onwards, and most of the early ones were set up, as you would expect, in Sydney. However, in this area, there were two very early local government areas established. In 1860, Orange and Mudgee both incorporated as municipalities, followed fairly rapidly in 1862 by Bathurst. Not to be left behind, Molong incorporated in 1878 to be followed by its near neighbour Wellington in 1879. The establishment of local government, the publication of local newspapers, the issue of directories showing the businesses in these towns demonstrated how far the little settlements set up in the 1830s had progressed in 50 years or so. It was only less than 30 years between the time that some of these places were established as towns until they were incorporated as local government areas, as municipalities, demonstrating that it was not just pastoral and agricultural settlement which was the key to opening up the land beyond the mountains, but the towns were an integral part of settlement across this district.